The Vallecas case, the only paranormal event in history with an official police report. The officer climbed the stairs slowly. It was late. The building on Calle Miguel Hernández in the Madrid district of Vallecas was quiet at this hour. The kind of quiet that settles over working-class apartment blocks in the small hours when the televisions are off and the children are in bed and the city outside has pulled back to a distant murmur. Officer Jose Pedro Negri had attended hundreds of calls in his career. Domestic disputes, accidents, break-ins, the ordinary catalog of human difficulty that fills the working life of a police officer in a major European city he had never attended. A call like this one, he knocked on the door of the apartment. It opened. The family inside looked at him with the specific expression of people who have been frightened for a long time and have finally, reluctantly, decided that they cannot handle it alone. He stepped inside. What happened over the next several hours in that apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández would end with Officer Negri sitting at his desk, opening his notebook, and writing words that no police officer in Spanish history had ever written in an official report before. He wrote that he had witnessed paranormal phenomena. He described what he had seen, specifically, in the careful, factual language that police officers are trained to use when documenting events. Not the language of hysteria or imagination, the language of a man doing his job, writing down what happened, trying to find words for something that his training had not prepared him for, and that his professional framework had no category to contain. That report still exists. It is part of the official record. It has been reviewed by investigators, journalists, and researchers who have examined it and found no evidence that it was fabricated or embellished. It is exactly what it appears to be. A police officer's account of something he witnessed and could not explain. That this is the Vallecas case. And it begins not with the police report. It begins with a teenage girl and a Ouija board and a lunch break at school that changed everything. Her name was Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro. She was 18 years old. She lived with her family in the apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández in Vallecas, a working-class district on the southeastern edge of Madrid, the kind of neighborhood where families know their neighbors and children, play in the streets below, and life moves at the particular steady rhythm of people who are not wealthy, but are not struggling either, comfortable, ordinary, safe. Estefanía was, by all accounts, a normal teenager. She went to school, she had friends, she had the interests and preoccupations of any young woman her age in early 1990s Madrid. Nothing in her history, nothing in her family's history, nothing about the apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández suggested that any of them were the kind of people to whom extraordinary things happen. And then one afternoon in 1990, during a lunch break at her school, someone produced a Ouija board. The details of exactly what happened during that session have been pieced together from the accounts of those who were present and from Estefanía's own description of events before her death. A group of students, a board, the usual ritual of fingers on a glass, questions asked into the air, the slow movement of the makeshift planchette across letters and numbers, the kind of thing that teenagers do in groups, half believing and half laughing, daring each other to take it seriously. Estefanía took it seriously. More than that, at some point during the session, something happened that the other students present described as disturbing. The glass moved with a force and a purpose that felt different from anything they had experienced before. Estefanía became distressed. The session ended abruptly. A teacher appeared and confiscated the board. Whatever was happening, it was interrupted, cut off mid-contact, if the participants believed there was contact at all. And Estefanía went home. Within days, she was not well. The change was rapid and specific in a way that her family found deeply unsettling. She was not simply unwell in the way that teenagers are sometimes unwell, tired, withdrawn, fighting off a cold. She was different. Her behavior changed. She became agitated at times and unnaturally still at others. She had episodes that her family struggled to describe accurately, convulsions or something resembling convulsions. States in which she seemed not quite present, not quite herself. She spoke of seeing things, dark shapes, figures, presences in the apartment that no one else could see. Her parents took her to doctors. The doctors examined her. The diagnosis that eventually emerged was epilepsy, which explained the convulsive episodes in medical terms, and which her family accepted because they wanted an explanation, and epilepsy was an explanation. But the medication that was prescribed did not appear to help. The episodes continued, the visions continued. The darkness that Estefanía described seeing in the apartment continued. Her condition deteriorated over the following months with a consistency that her family found terrifying and that the medical framework available to them had no satisfying answer for. She was not getting better. She was getting worse. And the things she described seeing were becoming more specific, more present, more impossible to dismiss as the product of a medical condition that should have been responding to treatment. In the early months of 1991, Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro died. She was 18 years old. The official cause of death was given as respiratory failure, a consequence of the convulsive episodes that had characterized her illness. But her family did not believe that was the whole story. They had watched their daughter deteriorate from a healthy teenager into something they could not recognize over the course of less than a year. And they believed with complete conviction that whatever had happened during that lunch break at school, whatever had been invited in when someone put fingers on a glass and asked questions into the air, had not left when Estefanía came home. They believed it was still in the apartment. And in the weeks after Estefanía's death, they began to find reasons to think they were right. Grief does strange things to people. It distorts perception. It creates an awareness of absence so acute that the absent person seems at times almost present. It makes people hypervigilant to sounds and shadows and the small disturbances of daily life that ordinarily pass unremarked. These are well-documented psychological responses to bereavement, and they matter in any serious examination of the Vallecas case. Because the family of Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro were grieving. They had lost a daughter, a sister. They were living in the apartment where she had spent the last months of her life. They were surrounded by her things, her absence, the specific texture of a home that still contains someone who is no longer there. All of that is true, and it is worth holding in mind. It does not explain what the police officers witnessed. But before we get to the police officers, we need to understand what the family experienced in the weeks after Estefanía died. Because the police were not the first to witness what was happening in that apartment. They were called because the family had already been living with it and had reached the point where living with it alone was no longer possible. The first incidents were small. The kind of thing that, in isolation, a grieving family might attribute to the particular heightened sensitivity that loss produces. Objects moved. Not dramatically. Not the furniture overturning, crockery flying violence of the most. Extreme poltergeist cases. Small things, in small ways, in places they had not been left. The family noticed, they noted it. They told themselves it was nothing. Then the sounds began. Not knocking, not the rhythmic rapping that characterized so many of the historical poltergeist cases we have examined on this channel. Something different. Sounds that seemed to come from inside the walls of the apartment, from behind surfaces, from spaces where there was no conceivable source. Sounds that the family found difficult to describe with precision, but that they agreed were not sounds a normal apartment makes. Not the settling of old buildings, not the noise of neighbors, not the ambient sounds of a Madrid night filtering through the windows. Something else. Something that made the family stop what they were doing and look at each other without speaking. Then Estefanía's mother saw something. She was in the apartment alone. The specific details of what she saw have been reported in different ways by different sources. But the core of her account is consistent. She saw a figure, dark, in the room. And then it was gone. She called her husband. She told him what she had seen. He did not dismiss her. He had been hearing the sounds. He had been watching the objects move. He had been living in the apartment for weeks since his daughter's death, and he had reached the same conclusion that she had. Something was there. The family's religious faith, they were Catholic. As the vast majority of Spanish families of their generation and background were Catholic, led them first to the church. They contacted their local priest. He came to the apartment. He blessed it. He prayed with the family. He performed the rituals that the Catholic Church provides for exactly this kind of situation. the blessings and the prayers and the holy water and the words that the tradition has, developed over centuries for the purpose of driving out whatever does not belong, that did not help. The activity in the apartment did not diminish after the priest's visit. If anything, and this is a pattern you will recognize from other cases we have covered, the Calvados haunting, the Rarick Parish case, the Mackenzie poltergeist, it intensified, as though the spiritual intervention had been noticed and had produced not cessation, but reaction. As though whatever was in the apartment had been addressed directly for the first time and had responded by making itself more present rather than less. Estefania's mother began experiencing physical episodes, convulsions, not identical to her daughter's episodes, but similar enough that the family found the parallel deeply disturbing. Here was the mother in the same apartment, experiencing the same kind of physical manifestation that had characterized her daughter's decline. The family's fear, which had been building since the weeks after Estefania's death, was becoming something more acute, something that could not be maintained quietly within the household. They called the police. Think about that decision for a moment. These were ordinary people, a working-class family in a Madrid apartment. Calling the police is something you do when there is a crime, when there is a threat you can point to and describe in terms that institutions can respond to. Calling the police to report paranormal phenomena is an act of desperation. It is what you do when every other option has been exhausted. When the priest has come and prayed and left and nothing has changed. When the family has watched the mother convulse in the same way the daughter convulsed. When the sounds in the walls and the figures in the rooms and the objects in the wrong places have accumulated beyond the point where any internal framework can contain them. They called the police because they had run out of everything else. An officer, Jose Pedro Negri, came up the stairs and knocked on the door. The officer entered the apartment. What he found was a family in a state of genuine distress, not performed distress, not the theatrical presentation of people seeking attention. The specific, exhausted, barely functional distress of people who have been frightened for a long time and are now frightened of one more thing, that no one will believe them. Officer Negri had been a police officer long enough to know the difference. He sat with the family. He listened to what they told him. He asked questions in the methodical way that police officers are trained to ask questions, working through the chronology, establishing the sequence of events, trying to understand what exactly was being reported and what, if anything, he was being asked to do about it. And then, while he was in the apartment, something happened. The accounts of what occurred that night in the apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández have been described by Officer Negri himself in subsequent interviews, and in the official report he filed, he was not alone. Other officers were present, and their accounts are consistent with his. What they describe is a sequence of events that none of them were prepared for, and none of them could explain that objects moved. In clear sight, with no one near them, a photograph of Estefania, a framed photograph of the dead girl sitting on a shelf in the apartment, fell, not slid, not was knocked, fell with a force and a trajectory that the officers found inconsistent with a simple, accidental fall. As though it had been pushed, as though something had directed it. Estefania's mother began to convulse, not in the way of someone staging a performance. The convulsions were violent and specific, and she was on the floor of the apartment before anyone could reach her, her body moving in ways that the officers found deeply disturbing and that required their physical intervention to prevent her from hurting herself. They held her. They tried to stabilize her, and while they were doing so, something else happened. A figure. The accounts of the figure vary slightly between witnesses, as eyewitness accounts always do when something happens quickly and under stress, but the core description is consistent. Something was seen in the apartment, dark, human in shape, but not human in its specific quality. Present and then gone. Seen by multiple officers who were in the room and who had no reason and no inclination to report what they were reporting. They were police officers. They were at the scene in their professional capacity. They had been called to an apartment to investigate a report of disturbance. They were not people who believed in the paranormal as a professional category. They were people trained to observe and document reality. They documented what they observed. The report that Officer Negri filed in the aftermath of that night is, as far as anyone has been able to establish, unique in the history of Spanish law enforcement. It is not the only police report ever to touch on paranormal phenomena. There are cases from various countries where officers have noted unusual events in their documentation, but the Vallecas report is specific in a way that most such reports are not. It does not hedge. It does not attribute the events to unknown causes or to the psychological state of the witnesses. It describes what the officers saw and what they experienced in the direct, factual language of official police documentation, and it uses the word paranormal to categorize those events. A police officer sat at his desk and wrote that word in an official report and signed his name to it. That document was not suppressed. It was not buried in a filing cabinet and forgotten. It became part of the official record of the case, and it has been reviewed and verified by journalists and researchers who examined it and found no evidence of fabrication. It exists. It is real. And its existence makes the Vallecas case something categorically different from every other paranormal case in Spanish history, because governments and their institutions do not acknowledge the paranormal, not in official documents, not with signed names and case numbers. The entire architecture of civil authority is built on the assumption that the world operates according to consistent, explicable physical laws, and that when events occur that appear to contradict those laws, there is always an explanation to be found if you look hard enough in the right places. Officer Negri looked as hard as he could. He could not find the explanation, so he wrote down what he saw instead. The Vallecas' case did not end with the police report. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it. The report was not a conclusion. It was a moment in the middle of something that continued after the officers left the apartment, and continued after the family eventually made the decision to leave as well. But before we follow the case to its aftermath, we need to go back to the beginning, to the Ouija board, to the school, to the specific sequence of events that the family believed initiated everything that followed. The date was sometime in 1990. The specific day has been obscured in different accounts. Some say spring, some say autumn. What is consistent is the setting: a school in Madrid, a lunch break, a group of teenagers, and a Ouija board that someone had brought from home. Ouija boards have a particular status in Spanish culture that is worth understanding. In Spain, they're known as the tablero, Ouija, or sometimes simply as the tabla, and they occupy a space in the popular imagination that is somewhat different from their status in Anglo-American culture. In Spain, in the early 1990s, in working class Catholic communities like the one Estefanía came from, the Ouija board was not simply a novelty or a game. It was something that serious people took seriously, something that the church had opinions about, something that carried a weight of cultural and religious meaning that gave using one a different texture than it would have had in a more secular context. The students who gathered around the board during that lunch break were not approaching it entirely as entertainment. Some of them were. Some of them were the way teenagers always are with things like this, half believing, half laughing, doing it because it was exciting and slightly transgressive and something to talk about afterward. But some of them, and Estefanía among them, took it more seriously, were more open to it, or more willing to engage with whatever it was that the ritual was supposed to reach. What the other students present described in later accounts was a session that started normally and then became something else. The glass began moving in a way that felt different, more purposeful, more directed. The questions that were being asked seemed to be receiving answers that felt less like the small, unconscious movements that skeptics attribute to the ideomotor effect and more like something responding deliberately to what was being asked. And then the teacher appeared. The teacher took the board. The session was interrupted. Whatever connection, if any connection existed, was severed abruptly. Without the closing ritual that Ouija board tradition holds is necessary to properly conclude a session. The board was gone. The students dispersed. The lunch break ended. Estefanía went back to class, and then she went home. And the change that her family noticed in the days that followed, the agitation, the episodes, the visions, the sense of a presence that she alone could perceive, began almost immediately. The question that the Vallecas' case ultimately poses is this: did the interrupted session do something? Is there a mechanism, supernatural, psychological, or some combination of the two, by which an abruptly terminated Ouija board session could produce the kind of sustained psychological and physical deterioration that Estefanía experienced in the months before her death. The skeptical answer is that the deterioration was medical. The epilepsy diagnosis was correct. The visions were a consequence of neurological disruption. The episodes were seizures. The death was a medical death, a respiratory failure during a seizure. Tragic and frightening, but explicable entirely within the framework of conventional medicine. The problem with the skeptical answer is that it does not account for what happened after Estefanía died. The skeptical answer explains Estefanía. It does not explain the police report, because the epilepsy died with Estefanía. The medical explanation ended when she did. There is no medical framework that accounts for police officers witnessing objects move and a figure appear in an apartment months after the person, whose illness might have generated some kind of psychosomatic explanation, was already dead and buried. Something was in that apartment. Something that had been there since before Estefanía died. Something that stayed when she was gone. Something that a priest's blessing did not remove and that a police officer's presence did not deter. What was it? To answer that question, we need to look at what Spanish investigators, researchers, and the church itself made of the Vallecas case in the years that followed. Spain in 1991 was not a country that had much institutional infrastructure for investigating paranormal claims. The Spanish equivalent of the Society for Psychical Research did not exist in any meaningful form. The academic study of paranormal phenomena, parapsychology, had a marginal presence in Spanish universities compared to its presence in the United Kingdom or the United States. The culture was Catholic, and the church had its own frameworks for understanding supernatural events. But those frameworks were theological rather than investigative, and they did not produce the kind of systematic documentation that cases like the Vallecas incident arguably required. What the case did produce was significant press attention. The story of the Gutiérrez Lázaro family, the death of Estefanía, and the police report filed by Officer Negri became known in Spanish paranormal and journalistic circles relatively quickly. The official police report, the existence of which was confirmed, and its contents reported, generated enormous interest precisely because of its institutional character. This was not a family telling a journalist about their experiences. This was a police officer writing in an official document that he had witnessed the paranormal. Journalist and researcher José Manuel García Batista is the person most responsible for bringing the Vallecas case to widespread attention in Spain. He investigated the case extensively, interviewed the family, reviewed the police documentation, and published accounts of what he found that became the primary source material for subsequent coverage of the case. His work established the basic chronology that most accounts of the Vallecas case rely on, and his interviews with the surviving family members provided the texture and detail that make the case something more than a dry official record. What Garcia Batista found when he investigated was consistent with what the family had reported, with what the police documentation contained. The family's accounts were coherent, internally consistent, and delivered with the specific quality that experienced journalists learn to associate with genuine testimony rather than fabrication. They were not looking for attention. They were not selling a story. They were a family that had experienced something they did not understand, and they wanted someone to document it properly. The church's response to the Vallecas case was characteristically cautious. Spanish Catholic institutions received reports of the events and conducted their own quiet inquiry. They did not issue public statements attributing the events to demonic activity, but they also did not dismiss the family's account. The priest, who had originally attended the apartment and performed the blessing, was interviewed by investigators and confirmed that he had witnessed events in the apartment that he found difficult to explain within a conventional framework. He did not elaborate publicly, but he did not deny it either. The medical dimension of the case was examined by several researchers, who attempted to establish whether Estefanía's death could have been caused by something other than natural medical causes. The official cause of death, respiratory failure during a convulsive episode, was not disputed in terms of its immediate mechanism. What remained open was the question of what had caused the convulsive episodes in the first place. The epilepsy diagnosis had been made under pressure, without the kind of sustained investigation that the complexity of Estefanía's symptoms perhaps warranted. Some researchers who reviewed the medical documentation found it less definitive than it appeared. The diagnosis had been reactive. Here's a framework that explains these symptoms rather than comprehensive. Whether it was correct in Estefania's case was something that the available evidence could not establish with certainty. What it could establish was this: Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro was a healthy teenager before the Ouija board session. She was dead less than a year later. The deterioration between those 2 points was rapid, specific, and resistant to the medical intervention that should have addressed it if the diagnosis was correct. And after her death, events continued in the apartment where she had lived that a police officer documented in an official report as paranormal. Whatever the mechanism, medical, psychological, supernatural, or some combination of all three, something connected those points. Something linked the lunch break at school to the death of an 18-year-old girl to the police officer writing at his desk at the end of a shift that had not been like any shift he had experienced before. Something moved through the Gutierrez Lázaro family's life in 1990 and 1991 and left marks that have never been fully explained. In 2017, a Spanish horror film called Veronica was released on Netflix. It was directed by Paco Plaza, one of Spain's most respected horror filmmakers, the man behind the REC franchise, which had already established him as a master of the found footage genre. Veronica was different from REC. It was not found footage. It was a carefully crafted, atmospherically dense horror film that drew directly on the Vallecas case for its premise and its details. The film became one of the most talked about horror releases of that year. Articles appeared in English language, media describing it as the scariest film on Netflix, the film that people could not finish watching, the horror movie that was making viewers turn it off before the ending. The social media attention it generated was significant, and it introduced the Vallecas case to a global audience that had never heard of it. It also changed the story in ways that matter. The film's central character is not named Estefanía. She is Veronica, a teenager in 1991 Madrid who uses a Ouija board during a solar eclipse and subsequently experiences escalating paranormal events in her family's apartment. The broad strokes of the real case are present: the Ouija board, the Madrid setting, the 1991 timeline, the apartment, the supernatural events. But the specific details are fictionalized substantially. Veronica is not Estefanía. Her family is not the Gutierrez Lázaro family. The events of the film, while inspired by the real case, are invented rather than documented. This matters for your understanding of the Vallecas case because the Veronica film is now the primary way most people outside Spain know about it. And the film's version of events, compelling as it is as cinema, is not the real version. The real version is in some ways more disturbing than the film because the real version has the police report. The real version has the officer's name. The real version has the documentation that the film does not need because it is a film and films do not require institutional verification. The Gutierrez Lázaro family had complicated feelings about Veronica. They had not been consulted during the film's development. They had not given their blessing to the use of their story. They were people who had experienced a profound and deeply painful sequence of events: the death of a daughter, months of terror in their apartment, an encounter with something that a police officer had felt compelled to document in official language, and they found the transformation of that experience into genre entertainment complicated and at times distressing. Estefania's mother, in interviews she gave in the years following the film's release, was clear about what she felt the film missed. It missed the reality of what happened. It missed the specific texture of living with it. It missed the particular quality of fear that comes not from dramatic supernatural set pieces, but from the accumulation of small, impossible things in an ordinary apartment over many months. It made the story bigger and louder and more cinematic. And in doing so, it made it less true. That what she wanted people to know, she said, was simple. Her daughter had used a Ouija board. Her daughter had died. And after her daughter died, police officers had come to her apartment and had seen what the family had been living with and had written it down in an official document because they could not do otherwise. That was the story, not the film. The file in the police archive the name at the bottom of the report. The word that Officer Negri had written and signed and submitted because it was the only word that fit. What he had seen. Paranormal. Let us look at what the skeptics say, because the skeptics have things to say about the Vallecas case that are worth taking seriously, even if they are ultimately insufficient to close it. The primary skeptical argument focuses on the medical dimension. Estefanía, on this reading, was genuinely ill. The epilepsy diagnosis was correct, or something related to it was correct. The visions and the sense of presence and the episodes were neurological in origin. The deterioration was medical. The death was a medical death. The tragedy is real, but it has a real-world explanation. This argument is coherent and cannot be dismissed. Epilepsy can produce exactly the kind of symptoms that Estefanía experienced. Neurological conditions can produce visions, altered states, a sense of presence, convulsions. The timeline between the Ouija board session and the onset of symptoms is consistent with the emergence of a neurological condition rather than necessarily with the supernatural explanation that the family preferred. But the skeptical argument has two problems that it cannot solve. The first is the coincidence of timing. Estefanía was healthy before the Ouija board session. Whatever was wrong with her began immediately after it. The skeptical position requires us to believe that Estefanía happened to develop a serious neurological condition within days of a Ouija board session, and that the timing was coincidental. This is possible. Coincidences happen, but it is a coincidence that requires explanation rather than assumption. The second problem is the police report. The skeptical explanation for Estefanía ends with her death, but the police report documents events that occurred months after her death. The skeptical position must therefore account for what the officers witnessed entirely separately from the medical explanation for Estefanía's illness. It must explain why experienced police officers, with no prior investment in the paranormal, wrote an official report describing events they could not explain in terms that went beyond anything their training had prepared them for. The most common skeptical response to this is that the officers were influenced by the family's account before witnessing anything themselves. They arrived at the apartment already knowing what the family believed was happening. Their perception of subsequent events was therefore shaped by that prior knowledge. What appeared to be a photograph falling strangely was simply a photograph falling. What appeared to be a figure was a shadow. What appeared to be an unexplained convulsion in the mother was a grief response. This argument is possible. It is the argument that skeptics make when eyewitness testimony is the primary evidence. The problem is that Officer Negri was not a person predisposed to supernatural explanation. He was a police officer. His professional training and his professional identity were both oriented toward rational, evidential accounts of events. When he wrote the word paranormal in his official report, he was not doing so lightly or enthusiastically. He was doing so because it was the word that fit what he had seen, and he was a man who wrote down what he saw. Could he have been wrong? Yes. Could the combination of a grieving family's testimony and an emotionally charged environment have shaped his perception of events in ways he was not aware of? Possibly. Does that explanation fully account for what he wrote and why he wrote it? You will have to decide that for yourself. The Gutiérrez Lázaro family eventually left the apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández. They did not leave immediately after the police visit. They stayed for a period after that night, living with whatever was there, trying to find some accommodation with the reality of their situation. But ultimately, the decision was made that they could not continue. The apartment held too much. The death of Estefanía, the months of events that had followed, the night the police came and wrote things in their notebooks, all of it together made staying impossible, and so they left. Whether what had been in the apartment followed them is a question that different sources answer differently. Some accounts suggest that the departure of the family was followed by a cessation of activity, that whatever had been there was associated with the space rather than with the people, and that leaving the apartment was sufficient to end the experience. Other accounts are less definitive. The family's subsequent history has not been documented in detail. That allows a clear answer to this question. The apartment itself has changed hands since the Gutiérrez Lázaro family's tenancy. It has been occupied by other families who have, as far as the available record indicates, not reported anything unusual. This is consistent with the interpretation that whatever occurred there was connected to a specific confluence of circumstances involving that family at that time, rather than being a property of the location itself. The school where the Ouija board session took place still exists in Madrid. The students who were present at that lunch break have not been publicly identified. They have not, as far as anyone has documented, given interviews or public accounts of what they witnessed. The session itself remains known primarily through Estefania's own description of it before her death and through the accounts of those who interviewed her family. The police report filed by Officer Negri remains in the archive. It has not been withdrawn or amended. Officer Negri gave interviews in subsequent years in which he confirmed the contents of the report and maintained that what he had written accurately reflected what he had witnessed. He did not sensationalize his account. He did not attempt to profit from the attention the case generated. He was a police officer who had attended a call and filed a report, and who maintained, consistently and without drama, that the report said what it said, because that was what had happened. He retired from the police force in due course. He moved on with his life. But in those interviews, when asked directly about the Vallecas case, he was always clear. He had seen what he had seen. He had written what he had written. And nothing that had happened in the years since had given him any reason to revise either the content or the conclusion of that official document. The case was brought to wider attention internationally by the 2017 Netflix film Veronica. The film's success generated a wave of articles in English-language media explaining the real events behind it, which is where most people outside Spain first encountered the Vallecas case. But those articles were typically brief. They summarized the basic facts. They noted the police report. They did not go into the depth and detail that the case actually warrants, because this is a case that deserves to be taken seriously, not in the sensationalist way that paranormal stories are often presented, with dramatic music and breathless narration and the assumption that the audience needs to be frightened rather than informed, but seriously, as a documented sequence of events involving real people, real institutions, and a real official record that says something unprecedented. A teenager died. A family was terrorized. Police officers witnessed events they could not explain. An official report was filed using a word that institutional documents are not supposed to contain. All of that is documented. All of it happened, and the question, at the center of it, the question that the lunch break at school opened and that Estefania's death did not close, has never been answered. What came through that Ouija board? What followed Estefania home? What was in the apartment on Calle Miguel Hernández that a police officer could see with his own eyes and document in his own words, but could not explain by any means available to him? The archive holds the report. The report holds the word paranormal, and that word written by a man trained to avoid exactly that kind of language, sits in the official record of the city of Madrid like a door left open. A door that Estefanía Gutiérrez Lázaro walked through in a school lunch break in 1990 and never came back from. You are sitting in a room right now. Your lights are on. Your phone is in your hand. The sounds around you are ordinary sounds. The sounds of your life, your home, your evening, and somewhere in Madrid in an archive. A police officer's report is filed under a case number. It says paranormal. And Estefania is still dead. And nobody has answered the question yet. What did they bring through?